Hey, and welcome to Varn blog. There's no introduction to the end because this is another solo project, but I wanted to respond to something that was shared with me on the internet that someone told me there was lots of good information in it. I I need to tell a lot of you that I think your uses of history are frankly pathetic. Um, and that while you benefit from the fact that you are arguing with conservatives who are even more pathetic in their attempts to ban things like critical race theory, that often the defenses that you posit have hidden agendas in the historiography to justify the current managerial state that you're just not willing to look at. Um, that's not actually progressive. It's not actually good. It's mostly a waste of time. But I'm going to go into a deep dive and I'm going to actually argue with an article to show what I'm talking about. Because a lot of people seem to be impressed by this article, and I don't know why, if they had any sound conception of U.S. history, and if they actually paid attention to some of the claims the article is making. Because what you find in a lot of these popular uses of history is they exist solely to justify the practices of a kind of elite. That, in a kind of elite discourse in which everything is done to justify history is used in his mind to come out with things that are obviously in the favor of a kind of elite discourse. Now, I don't like normally talking about elites this way because it's confusing. So let me be specific of what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about something like the PMC, but I am talking about the managerial state, which is currently in charge of capitalism, this weird phase of transition between neoliberalism and some post-neoliberalism that we see today. And what I've seen is a lot of people discovering a whole lot of hard truths about the American Revolution that is really soft on British administrative progressivism and rules of imperial law because of a few factoids decontextualized and put out there as if it was a answer to the problems in which American history exists in. And what I find particularly stellar about it is most people who I think are normally critical about it don't realize that this has actually got its own counter-conservative agenda to it. The historiography is serving to justify current political practices of a certain kind of cultural elite. And if you can't see that, it's largely because you're not used to reading history critically, that you believed the stupid patriot history, and thus these new counter histories are somehow opening up the world for you. But that would only be the case if you were a fucking moron to begin with. I got this from a patron and a fan. So don't think just because and I don't think this person is stupid, but when they talked about how much gold there was in this article that I linked in the description here, I read it and I was just like, this is normal bullshit. This is literally the Bidenist line. And it's really soft on Imperial Britain against the imperialism of the United States. And why is that? What's the agenda behind that historiography? Why can't you see it? You think it's with your progressive social democratic response to the current moment that it's somehow going to break open American history and free us into some kind of united colors of Benetton future? No, it is absolutely not. And if you can't read it critically, then I don't want you around. So let me actually get into the claims of this. Now, the books that it's referring to are not actually that bad. All right, I'm not actually railing against the books. They're kind of objective history books that go off the themes and contradictions of our own history. But if you don't understand the American Revolution was contradictory, that it had opposed impulses, that basically the bourgeois elites took advantage of a crisis from other elites, and that a bunch of different people got caught in the middle, then you don't really understand how most of history works. And perhaps you don't. Perhaps you believed a Whiggish notion of history. Well, that is not my problem, son. But I will read this article with you and kind of go over what I mean by it. And I can tell you that you'll immediately see some of the things that I'm talking about here. You can find this over on the New Republic, which, by the way, should tell you something. That's a centrist left magazine. I'll read the first paragraph. It's been some time since public school curricula sat at the center of America's culture war. That's not true. It's been nonstop for 20 fucking years. But panicked parents' politics have returned with a vengeance. Yes, that's absolutely true. And I can tell you this because in my state, teachers are getting fired for saying things like diversity and whatnot. So that's a fair assessment, but it's been true for the past, since all of America's history. If you don't remember this, remember all the wars about science in the 2000s and 90s. In Texas, a representative bill signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott specifically bans the state's educators from teaching racism and slavery or anything other than deviations, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. Which is interesting because liberals a few years ago would have considered such a statement a progressive stance, except that they're doing it to ban CRT, critical race theory. Now, what's interesting is what this article says critical race theory is. It should be set, excuse me. Motivations here are plain. Conservatives are hoping to engineer a wide and enduring backlash to the examinations of racial inequity in America's past that's been shaking up the Democratic Party politics and popular culture for the better part of the last decade. Totally agree. That is what they're aiming to do. No disagreement for me there. All right. So you're right about your enemies, but it's a very superficial point. It should be said that this is a doomed effort and the wrong one to fail. Our culture moment didn't begin with America's culture school, and it won't end in them either. Totally true. It will take more than the antics of Republican state legislatures to inspire conservative national pride in a generation of children who learned civics under Trump. A generation of children did not learn civics under Trump. That's 4 years of children, and very few did. I mean, come on. Get the specter of Trump out of your head for a minute, because that is not what is actually the most important thing going on. And for those young and old who have found themselves newly hungry for unvarnished perspectives on our history, there's no such thing as an unvarnished perspective on our history. There is more reading material than ever. That's true. Try as they might to muzzle our teachers. We all have the 1619 project and far more provocative material at our fingertips. Yeah, you do. The 1619 project is got like 2 academics. Most academics don't agree with it. And it's a historiographic, not a historical project. It's trying to explain the meaning of historical events, not the facts of historical events. And there is a difference. And frankly, if you look at the actual mixedness of the history, is the 1619 project's goal, despite trying to prove that the founders were largely concerned with expanding their own property rights, including their rights to own people, and that was true for some of the founders, absolutely. That it is also a kind of rehabilitation of British imperial power as a progressive force. Now, why would people who who are supposedly anti-imperial and anti-slavery trying to paint imperial power, in fact, the world imperial power at the time, as legitimate, even against local elites? So much of the soundest scholarship on our recent history remains largely inaccessible to lay readers. No, it doesn't. They just don't read it. Either sequestered away from general public behind academic paywalls or too dense and dry to hold interest to bond non-academic audiences. The latter is important, I suppose. Alan Taylor, professor of history at University of Virginia and two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. You don't win the Pulitzer Prize if you're behind academic paywalls, my dude. Isn't among the historians who have prominently utilized social media and other platforms to open up the work in recent years. But he has written 3 highly accessible introductions to early American history: 2000's American Colonies, 2016's American Revolutions on the Revolutionary War, and this year's American Republics, which covers the early republic from the end of the war to the Compromise of 1850. Their power lies not in the provision of tidy counter-narratives to our cherished national myths, because they're not. Counter-narratives to false narratives are also generally false narratives, so I guess that's a realization, except that that's what this article tries to reconstrain this as. That we find we really need from America's history is its chaos and contingencies, which I find interesting, right? This is the same lesson that people learned after 1968, is that history is in the chaos and contingencies. It's not in our plans. It's all just random acts, and our narratives about it's false. There's nothing new in that statement. It's actually been a historical assumption since the end of meta history in the 1960s as a popular academic discipline. But since you don't know anything about the way the historical discipline is done, you think that this is a profound statement from a fucking journalist. Of the 3 books in Taylor's series, American Colonies reads the most like a conventional textbook, blah, blah, blah. This is American history narrated through gritted teeth, and there's never been a larger audience for it. But although the liberal reading public is on our iconoclastic mood, reverence for the one obviously significant part of our founding history, the American Revolution itself, seems poised to survive the cultural moment mostly unscathed. Even as the hypocrisies of the founders has been subjected to new scrutiny, which it has been since the 50s. Liberals routinely frame these hypocrisies as betrayals of the principles that motivated the break from Britain and were given expression in our founding documents. Whatever the flaws of the men who made it, Americans across the political spectrum believed that the revolution was a justified insurrection that unified the colonists, animated by reason against their irrational and tyrannical British overlords. An American Revolution, Taylor challenges that the narratives and nearly 2.5 centuries worth of schoolhouse fables through which complex examinations of the Revolutionary War. Let me tell you something. Those schoolhouse fables about the Revolutionary War have not been commonly believed my entire life. I was actually not taught them. Yes, even in Reagan's America in the 1980s, there's lots of discussions about this, but I was not taught that all of our founding fathers were glorious people on a hill that had uncomplicated relationships, and all the propaganda we got from the Bicentennial Project in the 70s, even only 6 or 7 years after that when I was in elementary school. This is not new. This is not even new in our culture. This narrative is an easy narrative for liberals and progressives who finally decided that maybe they should learn a little bit of history and then use it poorly because their enemies were now beginning to politicize history again in a way they hadn't since the 60s and 70s. That they should maybe pay attention, but then they start mining it to make the British look good. And I want you to really think about what that is aiming to do. What is the implication of that? And I'll get to that in a minute. These and other edicts. Okay, excuse me. I skipped a part. With the proclamation of 1763, for instance, the British had barred the settlement of the west of the Appalachians in a vain attempt to prevent both expansive conflicts over Native American lands and keep colonial goods flowing to British-controlled markets. So notice that one of the things here is that the article is saying that it's good that all the colonial goods are being exported out to British control markets. All right. It's implying that this is a legitimate use of power. All right. Now, it is true that because of treaty obligations and because the British were actually warring with France over territory and using indigenous people as proxies for that they wanted the settlers to respect some of the treaties that they used to entice indigenous groups to side with the British over the French. The context of the American Indian War whose name is telling, is totally not really dealt with here. Britain had barred the settlement of Appalachians and events to blah, blah, blah. And to keep colonial goods front in British control markets, just a decade later, the Quebec Act of 1774, which expanded that territory and the rights of French Canadians after they were almost genocided, which it fails to mention, and the church within it, aggravated anti-Catholicism in the colonies below. Where did the anti-Catholicism come from? Who perpetuated that? Was it the colonies themselves? Because a lot of the colonies were founded by people who were booted out for their religious beliefs. Yes, a lot of them are rabidly anti-Catholic, but most of this had to do with the normalizing of peoples that had been basically made refugees and given almost no political rights under the French Indian War. Taylor gives taxation representation their due, of course. In the 1760s, citizens in England were paying roughly 16 shillings per capita to the empire each year. Colonists in the Americas paid roughly 1 shilling per capita, despite broader colonial prosperity and the expense of the French Indian War. Notice again that it's assuming that the French Indian War is valid, and even though that was fought for the expansion of territory of the British Empire, that the colonists who were conscripted to fight in it should be grateful. And this is taken as a normative statement and good implied in the historiography of this article, and which people do not even notice because they are not seeing the context of the history itself. It is giving you a counter narrative without all the context needed to understand it. Yes, American history is chaotic. Yes, it was dominated by inter-elite conflict. The demobilization of the British Army at the end of the French and Indian War dragged a depression as the British slashed their military expenditures and former troops entered colonial labor markets, bringing wages down. It's also funny that these same people will deny that like massive influxes of population depress wages. Now, I sound like I'm a conservative when I'm saying that, but it's actually a fact that it does. The issue with the immigration tail in the United States is actually there is an innate labor shortage because of the aging of the population, so that tail is not true in our case. All right, it's just again like, and that the economic productivity provided by immigrants actually does help everyone, but that's not always true, particularly in pre-modern, pre-technological societies. And this article just points that out as a factual condition and doesn't point out that it actually contradicts the very narratives it is trying to support politically at the same time, because it's hoping it's probably not consciously hoping this, but that there's so many assumptions and biases in the way that it's approaching the factoids it's presenting that you can't see what is going on in it. The demobilization of the British Army at the end of the French and Indian War triggered depression as the British slashed their military expenditures and former troops entered wages down. The new taxes felt steep to many of those struggling, and the revolutionary elites who worked diligently to channel their discontent in the direction that served their own immediate interest. Of course they did. Like, duh. The Boston Tea Party perhaps is a paradigmatic example of how elite messaging drove outrage, and Taylor debunks our folk history of the event, the British overtaxed our tea with palpable exasperation. To help the struggling British East India Company undercut smugglers importing tea from the Dutch Parliament, the Parliament in May 17 reduced the taxes on tea shipped by the company to the American colonies, Taylor explains. This angered colonial merchants, especially those who have been selling smuggled Dutch tea, and they scrambled to protect their businesses by denouncing the act. And Taylor writes, as a ploy to seduce Americans to sell their liberty for tea of the British monopoly. Notice that this actually paints the monopoly on tea by the East India Company as a valid construction, and thus that is why the whole taxation thing is a myth. Well, Americans prior to that bought smuggled tea so they can avoid the taxes, and the British turned a blind eye to it. So by lowering the taxes, they actually intended to enforce the taxation rates and also make you participate in a imperially sponsored monopoly that was created at the force of imperial gunboats. Of course, local elites hated that. And of course, they were able to use the resentment against that to their own perverse ends. That's how local elites in capitalist economies work. It does not mean that the original problems that these elites had was invalid for people in the colonies. If you had a smuggled, economy of black market tea so that you didn't have to buy the monopoly tax tea, even at a lower tax rate because you had to buy it, is nonetheless, for most people, an imposition of a tax that they didn't actually feel before. So this framing is the framing that these progressive taxes for progressive empire are actually legitimate and that the monopoly is legitimate. Now, I want you to think, what about the current political crisis would want you to believe that kind of thing? Why would this narrative be popular right now amongst centrist liberals? And why would dumb social democrats want to be pushing it? As elite patriots stoke their anti-British fervor, notice that they're not calling the British fervor also elite. They also migrated class tensions by controlling and sidelining radical populists like the shoemaker and mob leaders Ebenezer McIntosh, this is totally true, whose followers had rancorously demonstrated against the Stamp Act and the wealth inequity. Samuel and John Adams sought to marginalize Parliament supporters and nullify the Stamp Act without unleashing class warfare. Taylor's completely right. Rich patriots needed to reassurance that their resistance did not threaten them. They were given it as the organizations like the Sons of Liberty, a network of underground political clubs created to oppose British policies, gain new influence. The leaders, Taylor explains, were respectable tradesmen and merchants, but most had achieved wealth rather than inheriting it, and they often worked beside common journeymen and apprentices in their shops and on their wharves. This connection with common colonists facilitated organizations of parades, rallies, and other events that encouraged mass participation. This is what I want you to notice about the difference between the source material and this article. This article has to admit what the source material says, but it's still trying to frame it in sort of a progressive managerial state framework that it hopes you don't notice about. Because the empire was how we could facilitate all this multiculturalism, and they were even protecting the rights of other nations against those backwards populist colonist patriots. And there is some truth to that, but like I said, it was truth in the conflict of the French and Indian War, which, yes, as someone says, is a dumb name that totally shows that the English and American provincialism on the topic, because this was basically kind of a global war fought out over colonies between three European empires, that engaged all kinds of indigenous people to their peril. At the same time, the initial grievance and protest discourse was joined by heady conspiracism. Boston Town's meeting insisted that a deeply laid and desperate plans of imperial despotism has been laid and partly executed for the extinction of all civil liberties, Terry relates. That rhetoric struck Britons as so irrational that it must cover a colonial conspiracy by reckless demagogues to destroy the empire by seeking American independence. Neither plot existed save the powerful imaginations of its political opponents who distrusted one another. And Taylor, again, is right. The conspiracism was rife. But notice how this is framing it, the article itself is framing it in British legitimacy. When did British legitimacy become part of liberal anti-imperialism? This is nostalgia for one empire over another. One who actually gave us a framework for the other empire, almost whole cloth. Taylor rightly characterizes, as if this journalist would know what rightly was, that the war finally broke out at Lexington and Concord in 1775 as the war that triggered the clashes as far away as India between the British and its European enemies, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch, and as a civil war that pitted revolutionaries against both the British and their fellow colonists. Oh, yeah, true. Historians estimate between 40 to 45% of the right population was for the revolution at the outset. About 40% believed the Hackberry neutral, and while 15 to 20% were likely loyalists who opposed the war outright, including religious and white ethnic minorities, Scots, Anglicans, and Quakers, who feared the abuse if their distant crown lost authority that prejudiced their colonial neighbors. Notice again that crown lands are conflated with public lands. Notice again that the rights of minorities under imperial protection, and they're used cynically by the empire, by the way. I mean, the Scottish definitely were, are used as a justification for the current empire. It's similar to the fact that people in Canada today will cite the Crown's treaties with Indigenous people there as protections against the local Canadians, and that's why you can't get rid of the monarchy in Canada, because we need this archaic medieval institution that doesn't really stop shit and clearly couldn't protect the first peoples of Canada from, I don't know, the residential school system, because of the promises the Crown makes, which is binding because magic. And because we just can't trust anyone to ever not be selfish except for the empire itself. Now, why would a faction of liberals in the United States want you to believe that? I want you to think about that. Because, oh, the populist Trumpists are scary. And yeah, they are. Okay, I get that. But this idea that you are saving the republic somehow by representing these old forms that by accident or historical contingency happen to do a few things, and we should thus, is a very profoundly conservative ethos. I don't know why people think this is somehow liberalizing society in any way. It is an excuse for managerial understanding of history. The patriots would ultimately prevail over loyalists, not just military, but through ostracism, forced loyalty, oath apologies, ritualistic shaming, the destruction of loyalist literature before, during, and after the conflict, activities endorsed explicitly by many revolutionary leaders and implicitly by the Continental Congress, which recommendation the committees of inspection charged with identifying and outing opponents of the British trade boycotts as enemies of American liberty. Cancel culture was a weapon in the revolutionary arsenal, which also included mob and military violence against dissenters. Cancel culture was a weapon in the revolutionary arsenal. I can't think of a more dumbass populist framework for what is going on there. Yes, of course, human regulation of communities is based on things like ostracism. It does not necessarily make it a good or a bad, but it is a thing. But framing it as if, oh, cancel culture has always been with us, and look, the American Revolution was founded on cancel culture, even its most conservative elements were, is a gotcha that should only fool 2-year-olds. It should be no surprise, and I'm reading in, likely would to most Americans that the war itself was replete with dispossession, torture, and the rape of civilians as any other major conflict. Yep, totally. It should be no surprise. War's war. During the particularly brutal period in the Carolinas and Georgia, which despite this softness on Britain were actually the most loyalist of the crowns, why would the aristocratic planners, who were all slave owners, why were they so resistant to the bourgeois revolution if the bourgeois revolution was only about slavery? Which, by the way, anyone with any actual knowledge of the way things worked at the time would know that the loyalist standpost before the war was in the South, and then Canada, and what would become Canada. Actually, wasn't Canada yet. All right. In early revolutionary documents, they actually thought that the Scottish would side with against the crown, given the Jacobites, history with them. And so you actually hear appeals by early settlers talking about the incorporation of Nova Scotia and the maritime provinces into the United States. But this has largely been forgotten and even erased from the textbooks. And this doesn't mention this either. nor deal with it, nor deal with the fact that it was a very complicated history there, that the Scottish people were afraid of the crazy religious Brahmins of New England, but they weren't super happy about the crown. They just needed protection. They were the Scots were pro-British because they were afraid of the religious implications of the colonist, and the Scots that tended to be in Nova Scotia tended to be Catholic as opposed to Presbyterian Scots. At least that is my understanding. That was not always, that didn't always remain the case, but that anti-Catholic sentiment, which was rife in the colonies, which was stoked by the British themselves. All right, this is another thing that this doesn't deal with. Was being tapped down on for purely trade purposes. Well, you can't tap down on bigotry that you've been encouraging for trade purposes and expect it to go away on a dime. See that woke capitalism. Sorry, woke capitalism. You can't just pretend to be cool all of a sudden and people actually trust you. Or the bigotry go away because it's no longer profitable for you, but you've engaged in it for a fucking century and a half. And similarly with the British Empire. In Georgia, Taylor said loyalists tortured a patriot woman by using a musket lock as a thumbscrew. A French officer reported a pregnant patriot murdered in her bed with a message on the bed's canopy by her loyalist killers: "Thou shalt never give birth to a rebel." Which, by the way, which is why it was so nasty. All right, the true civil war of the American Revolution was largely in the South, because the ratios were closer to 50-50 there as opposed to 40-40-20 everywhere else. And like Taylor admits, even though the author of this piece seems to be hedging his bets, the original patriots weren't actually aiming to leave the British Empire. It was sort of an accident forced on them. One of the major atrocities that Taylor highlights elsewhere during the war implicates George Washington directly. In 1779, Washington ordered an offensive against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of natives in retaliation for guerrilla raids against the Continental Army. And the main village of the Onondaga people was destroyed, and the women of the tribe captured, raped, and killed. Because of most military of the Onondagas had already withdrawn westward to Niagara, Taylor explained, the attack victimized peaceable villagers who were easy pickings for a surprise attack. Yeah, so the colonial army did awful things to innocent indigenous groups, partly because it just couldn't tell them apart. Totally true. All right. But what this again skips, and one of the things I find interesting about this new historiography about like the 1619 project, is that historically speaking, one could be pro-indigenous or pro-abolitionist, but rarely were there anybody both. That's actually kind of a 20th century phenomenon. You can literally go and read letters where this person's talking good about abolitionism, and then it talks horrible things about the indigenous. And the other way is true. Well, if you're an abolitionist and you don't really want all the African American slaves sent back to Africa, to Liberia, a place that they probably weren't from and where they were not welcomed with open arms, honestly. A place that had wars because of that transfer of people for a century or so. It is important to note that if you want 40 acres and a mules to give to all the people, all the black slaves who made up literally 40% of the Carolinas and parts of Virginia, where are you going to get that land from if you're not dispossessing? Even if you dispossess all the planters, where are you going to get you still need more land than that. Well, you have to take indigenous land. This actually pitted black interests and indigenous interests against each other. Washington's appearance in the American revolutions are scantier than the one might expect, but the glimpses Taylor does offer suggest a ruthless and image-conscious man beset by anxieties that occasionally swelled to a state of suppressed panic, as illustrated by his public reactions to the proclamations of Lord Dunmore, the colonial governor of Virginia, offering freedom to patriot slaves who joined the British forces. The escapees, hoping to join the included runaways from Washington's Mount Vernon, and Washington's personally denounced Dunmore not as a military enemy, but an arch traitor to the rights of humanity. If my dear sir has not crushed before the spring, he worried, he will become the most formidable enemy America ever has. His strength will increase as snow bale by rolling. Were Dunmore to be killed in battle, Washington moves at another level. The world will be happily rid of a monster. Well, Dunmore was using freedom of slaves cynically. I mean, obviously. But clearly, like, Washington is fearing slave rebellions, and that was on his mind. You can't take that out of the founders from Virginia. But what's interesting is that the bourgeois of the New England, such as John Adams, was hostile to slavery. And so, for example, when you look at the American Revolution, the more conservative faction of the American Revolution, the ones that wanted less of a break with Britain, were the ones that were more likely to be abolitionists, as in John Adams and some of the Pennsylvania constituency. And yes, there were abolitionists before that time, because they were even calling, the idea that Madison and Jefferson were hypocrites is not new to us. Like, it was one of the things that you get out of the private letters of John Adams. Eventually, of course, the army was defeated, a disaster for the loyalists who, fearing for the persecution, fled America by the tens of thousands, founding a lot of Canada, let's be honest. That's where a lot of them went. And in 1782, a band led by David Williamson invaded the Indian country, seeking vengeance on tribes that had assisted or fought the British. Now, as awful as I think that is, historically speaking, it is not something that we would be unsurprised with the rules of war. It was done by progressive revolutionaries in Latin America to punish certain native tribes for siding with the Spanish. So it's not unique to the United States. And it was done even in places like the Russian Revolution for citing certain indigenous peoples of Siberia for backing the Tsar and the White Army, which is something even some Soviet defenseless friends of mine, hang their head a bit in a little bit of shame. So it's not something I want to justify, but it is something that was common. Such were the wages of liberty as settlers understood it and purchased war debts partially licensed after the war with, and one could tell Taylor relishes the irony of this regressive taxation. And yes, the taxation of the colonies was more regressive. In 1786, for example, taxes in Massachusetts were at least 4 times higher than before the war. And many states relied on poll taxes levied at the rate on every man, poor and rich. Recalling that the pre-war protests over small British taxes, some rural people complained. This actually leads to stuff like Shays' rebellions. Yes, I see the normal platypus talk in the commentary. Someone take that guy out and shoot him. Many Americans, at least many Americans above the Mason-Dixon line, have been taught the Union, the Constitution forged, was settled by escalating sectorial tensions over slavery, an issue that led to strained compromises failed to resolve gradually to the breakup and bloody conflict. Few intended or imagined possible until it happened. But in American Republic, Taylor tells a different story, one of an extremely fragile union perpetually on the verge of fracture and collapse over slavery and other less remembered tensions from the moment that the ink on the Constitution was dry. With the country wrestling with both internal divisions and geopolitical weakness on a continent dominated by other European powers, that was expected quite reasonably the humans' imminent failure. And as Taylor argues, the push westward expansion imagined now as a manifestation of America's confidence in its future was largely dominated by America's insecurities. The concept of manifest destiny, he writes, was not only justified settlement for its own sake, but also reinforced defensive imperialism so long as it nurtured by fearful Americans. Chief among their fears was that runaway slaves, natives, and foreign troops would hatch destabilizing plots from territories controlled by American settlers, a notion that made enlarging a nation seem strategically prudent. This is true. Senator Robert Walker of Mississippi and other expansionists argued, for instance, for the annexation of Texas on the grounds that the British would otherwise emancipate slaves there and send them north into the Union. Andrew Jackson, whose star rose in the military exploits and his crude xenophobia after the War of 1812, nurtured similar delusions up to his death. Slaves in Mississippi, speculated in an 1844 letter, would be worth nothing because they would run over to Texas and under British influence be liberated. He feared a future in which hordes of savages and former slaves set up by the British would wage war throughout the South. By then, America had been backed insurrections to further its own growth. Annexation of Rich Florida in 1810 began with a rebellion of roughly planters against the Spanish, secretly supported by the Madison administration and quickly followed by the deployment of American troops. Denying that its government had rallied the planters to begin with, Madison claimed that military had been sent to restore order. This inaggregated a new strategy for American expansion. Taylor notes, American settlers would rebel against a colonial power, establish a free republic, and create disorder that the United States would exploit to seize control. This model fostered aggression cloaked by claims of honoring international law. The model was attempted again in the remainder of Spanish Florida before the territory was invaded by Andrew Jackson and ceded by Spain in the War of 1812, which also indicates that the War of No, I will not. It looks as though the government sent a small force on purpose to bring war, so as a pretext for taking California. But at the inevitable Mexican attacks, Polk claimed that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil, and that the conquering California would help defray the expense of the war, which that power had long continued wrongs and injuries that forced us to rage. Taylor said, we had a long tradition of presidents seeking to make Mexico pay for American ambitions. And that's totally true. However, the Mexican War needs to be really thought about in a larger context, because the original goal by Polk was to take all the way down to Mexico City. And that was actually sabotaged by a coalition of people who were Catholic and thus sympathetic to Mexico on those grounds, and people who didn't want that many non-white settlers, because the settlements of mestizo peoples in closer to Mexico City were much higher. But there were still attempts to filibuster and reestablish slavery all throughout, up until like the 1890s. The most famous ones like Nicaragua, but that's not the only one. I mean, and nor was like Walker, for example, made famous by the Alex Cox movie, one of the only people to do it. You had the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was a breakoff of the Confederacy, proto-Confederacy, and then later post-Confederacy, to try to reestablish slavery in different parts of Spanish colonies, for the South to have some kind of base to join up with. However, it was not popular in the South because hostility to Catholicism and other parts of the Spanish colonies, even of the quote Criollo or white parts, made it something that a lot of the former Confederates did not trust, because they thought it was imperial, and that the imperialism is why races have mixed in the first place from their point of view. All right. So this is not taught very well at all. And what I get mad at, you see me in the passion I have at the beginning, is we're trying to like, oh, who's a better revolutionary? Who believes in Lockean provisos? No one really believes in like Lockean provisos, which, by the way, is the point that you were talking about, that I called was a point by Platypus, is something that I don't believe anyone actually ever believed. when Locke was writing it, he was also writing the Constitution of South Carolina. And so Jefferson being the better abolitionist is a line of horse shit for conservatives who want to pretend that they're revolutionaries. I consider them traitors. And you know what you do to traitors. Ulysses S. Grant, who served as a junior officer during the war, was among those sickened by it. I do not think that there was ever a more wicked war than the war waged by the United States on Mexico. And I think, Grant's one of these people, other than the fact that he was a horrible drunk willing to butcher Irish people, who actually does end up looking good in American history. So, take that as a grain of thought. I do not think he would later write, women and children were clinging to their knees of the murderers and shrinking for mercy. An American witness later recounted nearly 30 Mexicans butchered on the floor, most scalped, pools of blood for crevices and congealed in cots. It is plainly important to Taylor that his books are a account of all the blood that we've all let sleep through the cracks. Historical ignorance and denial aren't exclusive to the United States. Yeah, duh, they're not exclusive to anywhere. But outsiders have long found U.S. self-regard in the face of uncomfortable reality as extraordinary. I don't know why. They've obviously never met the British. Britain reported that Americans' restless and insatiable appetite for praise, which defied all restraint and reason of common sense. Another traveler practiced the self-deception of believing that they really were that which they only wished to be, which is just funny to me because the British, like if you talk to people in Britain today about the empire, you would totally see the same kinds of things right now. What do you think the whole collapse of the Labour Party is about? What do you think Brexit is about? Everyone likes to be flattered by their history. And the real history of the entire planet, every blood-soaked inch of this earth is blood and rape and toil. That's what it is. Grow up. We don't have to continue that way, but that is definitely what it is. Pretending that Americans are unique in their self-regard and ignorance of their own past is idiotic. And it is an inversion of the kind of self-blindness that you see amongst Americans in the first place. Because what it does is it makes since you can't be uniquely good, you must be uniquely evil. And you can feel good about yourself from the confines of your basement at home, since you make no other meaningful contribution to society. The habit of self-deception can imbue the reading of work like Taylor's with the thrill of accessing illicit knowledge. Yeah, it's only because you don't know anything. And one of the most subversive and challenging ideas of all the works of history offers the sense that history can also move backwards. In American Colony, Taylor takes a moment to describe the initial race order in Virginia where black slaves were allowed to accumulate property and purchase their freedom and go back into planting themselves. Because it actually changing, it's interesting that this law was actually changing slavery into something more like Roman slavery. Because colonial law did not forbid Brecht's progress, black freedmen and women could move as they pleased, baptize their children, procure firearms, testify in court, buy and sell property, and even vote. Some black men married white women, which was respectfully remarkable given the scarcity and high demand for wives for white men. A few black women took white husbands. All this collapse from the population growth amongst the slaves allowed the preservation of African cultural practices, and the laws that codified racial differences were introduced, obscuring white class distinctions among the shroud of white racial solidarity and rendering white Virginians indifferent to the continued concentration of the most property and world power at the hands of power elites. Similarly, in American republics, Taylor notes that the early years of the American Republic, which saw slavery collapse in the North, also saw attempts to constrain or roll back the rights of free blacks. Yeah, duh. I mean, if you don't know the history of Reconstruction, then yeah, you can believe in Whiggish history. If you believe in Whiggish history these days, and you believe in like unilateral, pure, clean, linear progress, just go become a Christian because it's eschatology. Reversals like this don't jibe well with the way most of us are taught to understand our history through strictly forward-moving narrative. We've been talking about the death of progress since the 70s. Quit pretending this is a new revelation, liberal reporter. Quit pretending this is meaningful, social democrats who discover this and think that it's speaking to you. If you don't know this, it's because you have had your head in the sand and you're not seeing what this is being used for. Similar petitions in the antebellum era gathered the significance of hundreds of thousands of Americans who were not actually ahead of their time, a pernicious and illogical phrase. They were inescapable as the slave drivers and the equivocating politicians they opposed, including many figures who left behind ample evidence of their private guilt and moral embarrassment over wrongs that we rightly castigate them for. This realization that our predecessors couldn't have known or done better is challenged by the examples of those who did. Many intellectuals capable of making more morally defensible decisions simply found material and ideological reasons to make others. One reason Taylor's work understands this fully, this isn't great man history, but the some guy's history, is political leaders and their famous patronage that tower over our imaginations are condensed to life size. They are grubby, horrid choices. They bumble, fumble, and scheme their way through the important moments alongside the extraordinary cast of madmen, buffoons, and grifters that Taylor brings to life. One, William August Boyles, appears before the British in a feathered turban to convince the Creeks, Cherokees, and American settlers to be united in a campaign to push the Spanish out of Louisiana and to conquer Mexico. He presented an ultimatum, which we should say Mexico was the new Spain. He presented an ultimatum vowing to invade Canada if the British did not back him. Aaron Burr pods out his life, killing Hamilton with a plot to seize Spanish territory, perhaps for his own new nation, and is captured and tried for treason, but not before fleeing a double-crossing co-conspirator. Jose de Galvanez, an inspector general for the Spanish crown in New Spain, has a mental breakdown in 1769 trying to subdue frontier natives. 2 years later, Galvanez returns to Spain and is put in charge of American policy as the Secretary of West Indies. Hell Carnival, the phrase that James Davison, a Jackson-era immigrant to the laws of Mississippi from prayer, is best conceivable description of all of this. American history for Taylor is both a horror and a farce. My friend, the history of everywhere is a horror and a farce. When we set down the romance of the powder rigs and the prose of elegant slave motors and genocide and heirs, that's what this mostly is, where they're an unfathomably stupid and cruel world, both totally alien and immediately recognizable to us now. We're living in, nonetheless, from an egalitarian standpoint, the best America anyone has ever known. All this is to justify the status quo. And to get social democrats okay with them doing it. And if you don't understand why that makes me mad, if you don't understand why what I see this bloody mess of history, a lot of which in the Taylor books, I actually like the books this article is referencing, but it's using it to say that we live in the most progressive time. We live in the Panglossian times. We have Biden. We have the future. Everything is good. Look, you know, the British Empire, that was okay. We just need a more woke empire. That's what this is. This is a plea for a more woke empire for someone who doesn't probably see you later. Doesn't even realize they're probably doing it. But this line, paired with the beginnings, tells you what you need to know. From an egalitarian standpoint, this is the very best America anyone has ever known. We are less equal economically than we have ever been. There has been no more unequal societies in human history than the ones that exist in the United States, Europe, and China now. If you are fooled by this nonsense, I don't need you. No one else does either. And yes, people are like in Africa and South America. Yes, actually, the Gini coefficient is really high everywhere on Earth, higher than it's ever been. And the United States is not the worst. It's in the upper middle, but it's not the worst, not by far. The prosperity of the U.S. gained after the 1950s, which was an accident of war. That's over, and we basically wasted it in a half a generation. But this stuff, we live in the best America we could live in, even though our history is chaos and bloody. The history of the past is ugly. We don't need to romanticize it. It's all a waste of time. Grow up. If you don't want the history of humanity to continue being rape, murder, blood drenched every inch of soil, you have to admit at first that that's what it's been. And not for just some of us. And not just for the top that happened to be the bloodiest and win more. That it's been that way forever for almost everyone. Yes, there have been non-bloody there have been non-bloody societies. There have been cities that formed and subsisted for hundreds of years. And then they were mowed down by empires. And we don't even remember their names and barely have their archaeological record. Now, I don't mean to sound like Ambrose Bierce, because I don't think this is what humans are necessarily doomed to. We are capable of a lot better. But you can't be capable of a lot better if you pretend that right now is somehow fundamentally different and is not as self-interested as the past. And that the past narratives were a lie, but we now can see the truth. Can we see the truth, really? Because everything this is framed in our current preoccupations, in our current modalities, in our current justifications. And the conclusion is we live in the best possible world. Now, the person who sent this to me is my friend. And so I said some really mean things today, and I might want to apologize to them for it. But I'm really mad that people can't see through this shit. That they think this is transgressive and revolution. Yes, the Taylor books actually kind of are transgressive and revolutionary because they make everybody looks bad in American history. Every bit of it is ugly. The Confederacy, the North, the British, the Americans, even the indigenous tribes who betrayed each other for different reasons because of political situations that we don't even remember because we've wiped out their history. At least most of it. I remember talking to a DNA friend of mine, and he was telling me about trying to resurrect the DNA worldview and how hard it was. That you basically had to resurrect things off of hints in the language and implications in the language and try to understand from those cultural contexts. And I remember thinking, well, the Dine are one of the larger tribes that still exist. And while that's not to undermine any claim of legitimacy they have, if they have that problem, can you imagine being from the smaller tribes that we barely remember their names? And how would you remember or know all the context? Yeah, oral history does have its own kind of reliability, but no culture is it completely something you can just take as truth. We cannot romanticize the past. That's absolutely true, but we can't use the lack of the fact that the past is not the vision that we think it was to justify the present. That last line of this article, this should really hit you. From an egalitarian perspective, the very best America, we live in the very best America anyone has ever known, when there's more differences in wealth and accessibility than there ever has been in human history. I guess the difference is it's not just about race now. Some are on the right are fond of saying that America is a nation and not an idea. What they actually mean by this is conceptually that the rightful inheritance of this particular segment of the country with this particular set of ideas about America. The perennial debates over this is with liberals, which they tend to frame as clashes between realism and naive idealism, are really debates between dueling idealisms. But the initial insertion taken into is more right than wrong. Before it's anything else, America is a polity, a material entity governed by a particular set of durable institutions and populated by 330 million people inextricably bound together here in our present. It is a field of contestation where our present and our future might be shaped and benefit all of humanity. And this great contest fully justifies itself. That is the identity and purpose enough. The anguish over the statutory school curricula and the rest of it in recent years have been underpinned by the conviction that asking what we're to do with American history amounts to asking what we're to do with America. Once we settled whether or not the American conscience is defined by original sin or high ideas, we seem to believe and we all understand our destiny. But America has no destiny. It has no conscience. There is no American DNA, no American soul. America will not be carried into hell for its crime. It will not be fated to repeat them. There is no moral engine will pull this country and the world extricably forward either. In the last century, the world would have seen both extraordinary expansion of social and political freedoms and bloodshed on an extraordinary technologically facilitated scale. We live longer, not all of us, just saying. And we live better lives thanks to the economic system that has nevertheless produced previously unfathomable levels of inequity, and that for a short time, profit and convenience relative flu is gradually undoing the basic systems we have sustained all human life on the planet. The popular narratives. How can you say this after saying what you just said up 3 paragraphs ago? How can you say we live from the egalitarian perspective in the best possible America while also saying that? Who are you trying to appeal? Why does this whole... Our tendency to look over the shoulders for directions has understandably given American historians a profound sense of responsibility. In some, that sense of responsibility has given anxieties that the darker readings of American past might exacerbate our political divisions and prove corrosive to our national ambitions. And those anxieties have come through in Gordon Wood's recent review of American republics for the Wall Street Journal, a piece that hits Taylor not for factual errors, but for his seeming antipathy towards Thomas Jefferson, a sin Wood suggests for which Jefferson Foundation chair at the University of Virginia and he has chosen emphasizes. Unfortunately, Woods writes, Taylor never offsets the depressing story with an account of the exhilaration, enthusiasm, and promise inherent in the flawed democratic country that has attracted millions upon millions of European immigrants. And although Taylor isn't technically wrong, Wood implies he is unacceptably dour, as though it's found our obligation to American historians to be unflattering cheerleader for the American project. But the fate of the project depends less upon historians than it does upon us, the readers, and the contours of the historical moment in which we happen to find ourselves. And the most valuable things historians have to offer us who want to take the country in a new direction are the missing pieces in our understanding of how we got here. Suppressed memories, lessons, and legacies to wrestle with, and an appreciation of forgotten events and decisions that continue to shape our lives today. If they correct or omit the official catechisms we've spent generations reciting millions of times over, so much better. We needn't believe in myths to believe in ourselves. I would counter that. We don't need to believe in ourselves. The belief that we've had. I guess I'm mad because when I read this article, when it's shared with me and I'm told how much it has in it, there are stuff in it. There's more in the Taylor books. Is that it still presents, it is still obsessed with false narratives that we don't even really believe, that we construct as straw men, and then conservatives try to make reality. Who care? I don't give a crap if people show up on social democratic organs. Like, do you want my real opinion on the majority of what we've called socialist media? That it's a piss poor funded for people, funding source for people who would have been on Air America if Air America had been viable. It's just as rooted with people whose background is Ivy League as anything else. It's just as rife with seed money. And it pivots at the political winds. If you can't see what you've been engaged with in all this, in the Bernie movement, in all of the, and I've been trying to get you guys, I've been trying to get you to look at this in many ways for 4 years, and I'm tired, and I'm angry. Because you still keep throwing the same bullshit at me that's, oh, we have the radical new America. It's all up to us. No, it's not. It is not all up to you. Quit pretending. If history is mud and blood and contingency, then it's just as random as a predetermined history that could have been no other way than it is now either. And it's not about our political will or our good meaning or how we remake the future. If we need the future, we have to start being able to say we have to impose a teleology where there is not one. We have to create that means where priorly it is just the mumbling and bubbling throughout history. That is what Marx said himself. And yet we continue to pretend that we can have it both ways. That we can pretend that there's nothing pernicious about pretending that things like monopolization in the British Empire was a good and that the elite colonists were bad for fighting it. That local elite's problem with Spain's, which is their cynical own power, but that's not what we're doing. We're different. We're special. We're not craven like the prior elites. Most of what you are doing is narcissistic justification of the fact that most of your communities have been deracinated and you are replacing it with a political ideology that you can neither affect nor people who actually are engaged in it give a shit about you for. That's what we're doing. You can have a parasocial relationship with some YouTuber like me who feeds you a line of bullshit. And when I quit feeding you a line of bullshit, you'll turn on me. Right? I mean, because that even happens to Trump. Eventually, you try to pivot from your own stuff and say, endorse the vaccine, and people just don't want to hear it and they cancel you, even though they made you their God King, which tells you that you were never their God King, that what was going on was a view of how you saw yourself. We have nothing to do with Uber. If you can't see through articles like this, which have a lot of good in them, but their ultimate framing is both, we can live in a better world and we can make a better world. Like, we live in the best of all possible worlds, and yet we could totally do better because everything is awful now. We have massive insecurity, but this massive inequity is probably the best we could have hoped for. We can maybe do better in the future. I'm mad because people can't see through this. I'm mad because all of this, I've been telling so many people, that you cannot trust the historiographic framing that you're given, that it all is motivated. You need to understand how and why. You don't have to be stuck between a Whigist view of history and a conspiracist view of history, but you clearly are. And this article wants to have it both ways too. It wants to say the past was totally, random and arbitrary, and our elites were venial, and they were. Okay, but we should have already known that. And a lot of the things that it posits against is stuff that most Americans have never really totally believed and is not new. But that falsity has led to conspiracism, has led to this, that, and the other, because the appeal that most people throw back at people when they start thinking for themselves and prove that they can't think is trust the experts that's led us here in the first place. To double down between two sides of a failing system, a failing economy. That's what this is. Go read the Taylor books, but don't buy the articles about it. I'd like to talk to this person who wrote this, because I really don't understand how they contradict themselves this much. And I'm going to end this because we clearly have someone in chat who's just a troll.